there's a proving that's happening when we don't acknowledge, because you're not learning that what has actually happened and what you've already done. So there was a client I was working with that always wanted to prove their resilience and would go out of their way through work and with relationships and complicated relationships that they were having, particularly at work, to prove that they were resilient enough to withstand this toxic relationship at work. And it was a big moment for us to sit down and say, I think it's time for us to acknowledge that you are a resilient person, that you no longer need to prove that you are resilient. You've proved it time and time again. So let's raise into the light. Let's acknowledge the fact that you are a resilient person. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You're resilient. And taking a moment to breathe that identity in, not having to prove it, but are it, acknowledging that, now we can go to the next thing. We can go to the next phase. We've been spending so much energy trying to prove resilience time and time again. There's nowhere else to grow. It's taking up all of our growth energy. And it really, really had a huge effect on this person and moving forward with how and where they wanted to grow in their work, and my personal favorite, how they wanted to grow as a human. Hello there, I'm Holli. This is the Heartmind podcast. I'm so excited for the very first full episode. It's a solo episode where I'm going to talk to you about the heart mind and just open up this podcast, what it's about, and what the heart mind means. Some of you might be wondering. And I did a poll with social media to try to find the right wording and phrase, and it became clear just to simplify it. So there was heal your heart mind and all these different types of activating and being with your heart mind, but just getting it really simple, heart mind with Holli. Have you ever noticed, I'm going to really ask you to now try to notice, when people talk about the mind, they're always pointing here. And there's also always a battle that people want to create between here and here. And while I kind of understand it, and we can talk about that in greater depth for sure as the podcast goes, and I want to ask so many guests as well about this phenomenon, I want you to start to notice when people talk about their mind, how much they're talking about one aspect of the mind, which is located more in the head space, and it's talking about thoughts. But your mind is much greater than that. And your mind has various layers, particularly when we talk about yoga and we start to get into breathwork somatics. And your mind, the center of your mind, is right here. And often it's called the heart center, right here. And it's a space and a place that is very often spiritually denoted as a center of ourselves. But I want to argue, and many people do, that this is the center of our mind. And then it starts to drop our awareness of what mind is a little deeper into the body. And it expands what our mind is to mean more than the rational mind. And it includes the brain. And the brain is an incredible, important hardware, but I believe we have a brain bias often. And the brain bias is that the nervous system and the brain is our mind. And there's this huge fad, and it's needed, this fad. Like, that's why fads happen, right? To regulate your nervous system. Well, I'll tell you the quickest way to regulate your nervous system, which most people know, is through the breath, right? And the breath is actually coming right here because part of this heart center includes the lungs. So your respiratory system and your cardiovascular system is actually the center of creating health in your mind. Of course, there's so much that's going on in the gut, but again, the king in Chinese medicine, therefore, like the leader, the center of the mind, including the gut mind, is your respiratory and your heart cardiovascular system. And often in yoga and in the East, these two systems are really hard to separate. The respiratory system and the cardiovascular system, they're in direct relationship, right? And that's happening right in those alveoli, right at the end of your lungs where the capillaries are attaching and they're having this exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc. And it's there that we can start to really create big shifts in our mental health. This is really easy to say, it's really easy to conceptualize, but it's much harder, right, to actually live by it. So even when I'm working with clients, I'll start to say mind and I'll start to point to my head, right? And so it takes a whole relearning and refeeling into what really the mind means to you. So, with this podcast, I want to start to develop heart mind intelligence, where we start to really recognize and honor and create practices and conversations around what the mind is. And I have this question that's been following me for all my life. If you want to hear more about my story with this journey, please check out the link below for that story. But all my life, I've been asking, why are we so sick, particularly mentally? But I could see the trauma and the sickness mentally starting to manifest physically, particularly with women. And the question just kept and continues to keep driving me. Why are we so sick? And I know trauma is a big buzzword and some people resist it, but we have been inundated with trauma, particularly women, taken away our power and taken away from our ability to mentally have agency. I am also a playwright, so I haven't been writing plays lately. But one of the things that irked me so much when I was writing plays was that often male teachers, but not just male teachers, would give feedback to female writers about how we didn't have enough agency, our characters didn't have enough agency. And I wanted to write a play. I never did. I almost did, called From Vacancy. And it's this idea that many of us women have experienced sexual trauma, 1/3 reported. There's totally a whole nother layer of women that have not been reporting or maybe don't have that conscious awareness, but somatic awareness of being abused. And it leaves us mentally vacant. Our minds do not want to come into our bodies. It leaves us vacant. And to have men tell us then within our stories that we need to have agency, it kind of creates, what's the best word to use here? It creates, someone could help me out even, but hypocrisy in a way of taking away agency as a culture to women and then pressuring us and telling us that our stories must have it, when a lot of our stories, we don't. And that is the journey. I'm not saying that it's not the journey. The journey of the woman or male that has been rendered vacant and homeless to their bodies is to reclaim it and to find agency and to find a sense of empowerment over time through their own willpower. I completely and utterly believe in that. And it's really difficult. And it can be quite confronting when someone maybe that doesn't have that background tells us how to do it and how to tell that story. So, how do we start to heal? But more importantly, the Heart Mind Method and the Heart Mind podcast is asking how do we start to re embody and do so not just to cope, but to create a warm, nurturing, enlivened, exciting home within our own existence, which includes this vehicle, this manifestation of our mind, our physical bodies, and then that's the home, the vessel for our minds, and if you so choose, your spirit and soul. How do we create that nurturing, loving place to come home to within ourselves? Whether you have a physical home or you travel a lot, or even if the means of creating a physical home is difficult, how do we create it within ourselves? That's the big uh, calling, and it's what I'm trying to create with the podcast. Okay. And so every week I will have a theme. Every week I'm going to come to you with a theme around creating that home and healing and thriving within your own body, mind, heart system, your heart mind. And I will also hopefully have a guest every week. I'm starting out, so we'll see where I might have a week where there's no guest, but every week I'll have a theme. And I'll talk to you about that theme in relation to the heart mind. The heart mind, in creating that home, there's some pillars we're going to create, like the pillars that hold up the structure. There's a foundation, and there's even a shelter that we create. And I'm going to just start with the fundamentals today, talking about the foundation. The foundation is accountability. Accounting for your life, accounting for your energy, accounting for your mind. So having the ability to account for that, often it takes a joint effort of learning skills and finding mentorships of how to account for those things. Because when we're disembodied, it becomes really hard to create that structure and that ability to do that. And accountability, whether it's accounting with your finances or accounting with your emotional growth, your mental, spiritual growth, it is about structure, right? So that's the foundation, creating accountability for yourself. One of the pillars is going to be boundaries, and this has a lot to do with safety and being able to discern. So oftentimes we lose that sense of discernment and trust in our own boundary setting and discernment when we have been abused or when we have been harmed. And so rebuilding that pillar and finding the affirmations and the practices and the needs to build that strong pillar of boundary setting, but also boundary releasing. Sometimes the boundaries are too tight. So we want to have flexible boundaries where we discern what comes in and what goes out. We discern for ourselves what comes in and what comes out, mentally, energetically, emotionally, and then physically, of course. Another big pillar, and I talk about this quite a bit. I do talks around this specific subject is forgiveness. And this is incredibly needed for that heart-mind center and for healing and creating peace with wounds. And if you're human, you've been wounded. If you are human, you have wounded someone else, which actually creates probably a bigger wound within yourself to hurt others. So, um, forgiveness is just an incredibly needed pillar to creating that home. And I'll have a whole week on forgiveness where I'll talk about the ingredients of forgiveness as well. Another big pillar is acknowledgement. And so that maybe sits on another end of the house that we're creating. This acknowledgement is raising into the light what you have done, what you are doing, who you have been, who you are being. Raise that into the light of consciousness. And in a way, praising your path so that every time you raise that acknowledgement of the work that you're doing, but also who you are and who you are becoming, every time you raise that in the light, you're growing in your knowledge. I just did it. You're growing in your knowledge of yourself, your mind. Yeah? You're growing who you are. You're expanding and grounding into who you are. And oftentimes, again, a lot for women, not always just women, though, this is something that we want to poo-poo. And in fact, we go in the other direction of self-deprecation, raising into the light all the things that are wrong with us or that we're doing wrong. And yes, that can be funny, and it can be fun to point at mistakes and all of these things. And there's this type of an acknowledgement there, right? Acknowledging our little picadillies, for example. And comics are great at it. But with this work, I also like to acknowledge the positive, acknowledge what you're doing. Oftentimes, here's an example with a client, you know, there's a proving that's happening when we don't acknowledge because you're not learning that what has actually happened and what you've already done. So there was a client I was working with that always wanted to prove their resilience and would go out of their way through work and with relationships and complicated relationships that they were having, particularly at work, to prove that they were resilient enough to withstand this toxic relationship at work. And it was a big moment for us to sit down and say, I think it's time for us to acknowledge that you are a resilient person, that you no longer need to prove that you are resilient. You've proved it time and time again. So let's raise into the light. Let's acknowledge the fact that you are a resilient person. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You're resilient. And taking a moment to breathe that identity in, not having to prove it, but are it, acknowledging that, now we can go to the next thing. We can go to the next phase. We've been spending so much energy trying to prove resilience time and time again. There's nowhere else to grow. It's taking up all of our growth energy. And it really had a huge effect on this person and moving forward with how and where they wanted to grow in their work, and my personal favorite, how they wanted to grow as a human. The fourth and final pillar for now is emotions. I, in my other video, talked about grief because it is a primary emotion, but all emotions. And here's what it is about emotions. Trusting them. Trusting emotions. Trusting emotions as a key aspect of our mind and a gateway to action and growth. All right? Trusting our emotions. So one more time, the 4 pillars, we have foundation is accountability. Then the 4 pillars: forgiveness, cleaning wounds. Then we have our boundary setting for safety and flexibility. We have acknowledgement, bringing into the light. And then we also have the final one, emotions and trusting them, which is really hard. I've really dug deep into the land of business, sales, and marketing, and they're all about turning off those emotions. But I think it's a critical key to your business teams as well, and running a healthy business, trusting the emotions. So that's a quick introduction to the methods in which I use to help build this home for people, but also I will be talking about throughout the podcast. Each one of those segments of the house has lots of little parts to it. And so that's how we'll keep kind of getting juice out of each one of those different themes, out of each one of those. For example, one of the ingredients to forgiveness is compassion. Now, that's a really interesting and beautiful topic that we will use within this podcast. Talk about different ways different cultures look at compassion. What are acts of compassion? What are some definitions? How do we practice it? That's one example. The structure of the show is, again, I'll give a healing episode first in the week, and it'll be a solo episode, short, great for commutes, about 30 minutes each session. And then I will have a guest most weeks to talk about that topic and their particular insights, leaders in their fields around that topic, that theme. And then at the end, I'll do another solo session where I talk about the transformation. So healing and transformation go hand in hand, but they're almost like two sides of a coin. And so the healing is a little bit more nurturing, feminine, and then the transformation is a little bit more pushing and masculine to help support that same goal, right? So we're coming at it from two different angles, one from healing and nurturing, one from transforming and expanding. And that will be the week. I'll start next week with a theme, and I hope to have you. I'm diving in right away next week with the theme of, here's a big one, safety. Ouch, safety. I'll give this as an example, so as a teaser. So the first session with safety is going to be an affirmation that supported me. Affirmations are really important that you feel the affirmation here in your heart mind in the center, not just trying to get through with thought and repetition of rational, okay, this should be true, this needs to be true, just start to change, right? But it needs to be a feeling that you sense, and that's that epiphany feeling, recalibrating your cells to believing that thing, which nothing creates that stronger than emotion and having an emotion behind it. So I'm going to share with you an affirmation that truly helps me both acknowledge what happened, but know that I am safe. Okay? I'm going to share that affirmation and talk about it more in the first session. Then I'm going to have a guest on to talk about their journey through that as a practitioner and as a person, and that's a breathwork practitioner. Can't wait to introduce them and talk to them more and share their work with you more. And then the final session is going to be about actually a little more towards risk and being okay not being safe and why. And there's this beautiful quote that I'm basing this on by Anodea Judith called, and the quote says, "Give up being safe." I'm going to talk about why that actually keeps you more safe. All right. So there's some irony there. And that's the journey of the podcast through the weeks. All the individual ones will be shorter, 30 minutes, and then the interviews will hopefully be a little bit longer, a lot more content, and a lot of more conversation to be had between me and the guest. Subscribe. We are going for a goal of 500 subscribers by the end of the year. Subscribe and share with someone else that might be going through a tough time or working through trauma and might be supported by some of these somatic stories, as well as a journey through body, mind, spirit, and into the heart mind. Travel well, enjoy your life, enjoy your yoga, whatever that means to you, and I'll see you next time.